If Earth lost its atmosphere overnight, the world would not explode, it would go silent. That would be the first sign. Not the sky, not the cold, not the sun. The silence. Sudden, total, unnatural silence. Because the moment the atmosphere disappears, sound disappears with it. No wind, no traffic, no engines, no footsteps, no birds, no distant city hum, no leaves moving in trees, no air conditioners, no planes above you, no voices crossing the street. Even if someone screamed right beside you, you would not hear it, because there would be nothing left to carry the sound. And that is what makes this scenario so disturbing. For a few seconds, the world would still look normal enough to confuse you. The road would still be there, the buildings, the mountains, the ocean, the people around you. Everything visible, still in place. But the invisible layer that made all of it livable would be gone, and the planet would begin to fail before your mind had time to catch up. If Earth lost its atmosphere overnight, you would not get a warning. No countdown, no siren, no message from the sky. You would simply be inside a world that had just lost one of its most important systems, and for a brief moment, your brain might refuse to believe it. Because almost nothing in daily life trains you to imagine that the air itself could vanish. We are used to weather changing, used to pressure shifting slightly, used to storms, heat, cold, fog. But none of those prepare you for the absence of atmosphere. Because atmosphere is not just weather. It is the condition that makes weather possible. It is not just something above you. It is the environment your whole body is designed around. Your body would react immediately. You would try to inhale, automatically, desperately, but there would be no air to pull in. Your chest would rise, your throat would open, your lungs would search for oxygen and find nothing. Not thin air, not bad air, nothing. And within seconds, your body would know that the exchange keeping you alive has stopped. Because breathing is not just movement, it is transfer. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And that process would end all at once. Your first instinct might be panic, not because you understand the physics, but because every system in your body would suddenly begin to fail at the same time. You would try to speak. You would try to call out. You would try to ask what just happened. But your voice would vanish the moment it left you. Not swallowed by distance, not drowned by noise, just gone. Then the sky would change, fast. Without the atmosphere to scatter sunlight, blue would disappear. The familiar dome above you, the soft daylight sky you have seen your entire life, would collapse into black. Not evening, not storm, not night. The black of space. Deep, empty, absolute. And against that black, the sun would still be shining. But it would no longer look warm. It would look sharp, hard-edged, unfiltered, almost violent. Because there would be nothing left between you and raw sunlight. No haze, no blue, no diffusion, no softening layer, just direct light falling onto an exposed world. This is one of the strangest parts of the whole idea. The Earth would still be here. The oceans, the continents, the cities, the roads, the houses, the forests. The planet would not vanish, but it would stop behaving like a place built for life, almost instantly. Because the atmosphere does far more than give you something to breathe. It provides pressure, it regulates temperature, it scatters light, it carries sound, it moves heat around the globe, it makes clouds possible, it makes weather possible, it slows meteors, it shields the surface from radiation and vacuum. It helps keep liquid water stable. It is not decoration around the planet. It is part of the planet, one of the most important parts. And if it vanished, the surface of Earth would not become empty. It would become exposed. Within seconds, the pressure outside your body would collapse. And that matters more than most people realize. Human beings are not designed for vacuum. Not because we are weak in some abstract way, but because our bodies depend on surrounding pressure to keep internal systems stable. When that pressure disappears, the balance breaks. Moisture on your eyes, on your tongue, inside your nose, inside your airways, would begin to evaporate rapidly. Not in a dramatic movie-style burst, but fast enough to become dangerous almost immediately. Gases dissolved in your body would begin to expand. Soft tissues would swell. Your skin would not burst open. Your body would not explode. That part is myth. But it would begin to lose the stable physical environment it was built to exist within. And once that stability is gone, everything starts drifting toward failure. At the same time, oxygen already in your blood would continue to be used. Your brain would keep burning through it. Your muscles would keep demanding it. Your heart would keep moving it. But there would be no new supply. And that means your window of useful consciousness would be very short. Maybe 10 seconds. Perhaps a little more. Not much. Just enough time to realize that the world around you has become something else. That number is what makes this scenario feel so brutal. 10 seconds is not enough to make peace with anything. It is not enough to understand the sky. Not enough to find your family. Not enough to run anywhere meaningful. Not enough to formulate a plan. Just enough to know that something impossible has happened. And then, the systems that make thought possible would begin to fail. Anyone fully exposed outside would lose consciousness quickly. And after that, without oxygen, without pressure, without any real protection, the body would continue shutting down. Not because Earth exploded, not because of fire, not because of impact, but because the background conditions that make biology possible would have been removed. And this is what makes the atmosphere so easy to underestimate. You do not see it directly. You live inside it so completely that it becomes invisible to your mind. But the moment it is gone, everything reveals its dependence on it. Speech, breath, hearing, pressure, warmth, weather, protection, clouds, water, life, all of it. And this is not only about people standing outside. Aircraft in the sky would be an immediate crisis. Anything depending on aerodynamic lift would stop behaving normally. Jet engines that require air would lose the medium they rely on. Open flames would go out. Birds in flight would no longer be flying through air. Clouds, if any remained for even a moment, would vanish from a sky that no longer knew how to hold them. The living world would not get a warning. It would get an interruption. Sudden, global, merciless. But even that is only the first layer. Because after the silence, after the failed breath, after the black sky, after the short window of consciousness, the planet itself begins to change. The Earth is not just a place with life on it. It is a system held together by a thin shell of gas. And once that shell is gone, the world you recognize starts disappearing with it. Not all at once, but fast enough to become something else. And that is where the real transformation begins. Because after the first minute, the question is no longer only how long a human could survive. The question becomes larger. What happens to oceans, to weather, to light, to heat, to the planet itself? Once the atmosphere is gone, Earth does not become peaceful. it becomes exposed, and exposure changes everything. At first glance, the planet might still look recognizable from the ground. The land is still there, the oceans are still there, cities still stand, roads still stretch across continents, mountains still rise, rivers still cut through valleys. But the systems that made Earth feel alive would begin collapsing almost immediately. Because without an atmosphere, there is no weather. Not strange weather, not extreme weather, no weather at all. No wind moving across the surface, no clouds building on the horizon, no rain, no storms, no thunder, no fog, no haze, no moving fronts, no air mass to carry heat, no sky to move water, no medium to create tomorrow's forecast. Weather would not become violent, it would end. And that silence would not feel clean, it would feel wrong. Because Earth without weather is Earth without motion, in one of the deepest ways we recognize. The air is always doing something, even when you do not notice it. It presses against your skin, it carries smell, it carries warmth, it moves seasons from one region to another. It softens the sun in one place and holds warmth in another. Once it is gone, the surface of the planet stops being buffered, and buffering matters, more than most people realize. Without air to hold and move heat, temperature would stop behaving the way it does now. Places in direct sunlight would heat brutally. Places in shadow would cool brutally. Day and night would separate more violently than they ever do now. The atmosphere softens those extremes. It spreads energy around. It keeps differences from becoming absolute. Once it disappears, the surface begins to act more like the moon, more like Mercury, more like a world without a living blanket around it. During the day, sunlit regions would receive raw solar radiation, not filtered, not scattered, not softened. Surfaces would absorb heat directly. Metal, stone, glass, soil, everything under the sun would begin responding more harshly. But at the same time, the moment darkness came, that heat would escape quickly, because there would be no atmosphere to trap it, no air to hold warmth near the ground, no layer above you to prevent the surface from radiating energy back into space. This is one of the strangest consequences. Earth would become a place of temperature violence, not because the sun changed, but because the system that once moderated the sun would be gone. Then there is the water. This is where many people imagine the oceans instantly vanishing. But the reality is stranger than that. The oceans would not simply disappear in one dramatic moment. They would begin to react, and the reaction would be unstable. At the surface, liquid water exposed to vacuum would no longer behave normally. Some of it would begin to evaporate rapidly, some of it would boil. Not because it had become extremely hot, but because the pressure holding it in liquid form had collapsed. At the same time, that rapid evaporation would remove heat, and cooling matters a great deal. So even as the uppermost layer of exposed water begins to turn into vapor, the surface would also begin to cool and freeze, which means the oceans would not just boil away like they do in a simple cartoon version of this idea. They would do something more complex and more eerie. Their surfaces would begin to boil, cool, and then freeze. A world of water trying to exist without the pressure that once stabilized it. Over time, more water would be lost, some to vapor, some to ice, some eventually to space. But not in one clean stage, in transitions, in instability, in a sequence that feels less like destruction and more like a system forgetting how to behave. Rivers would stop behaving normally too. Lakes, wetlands, reservoirs, snowfields, glaciers. Every exposed body of water would begin responding to the same new rules. And because there is no atmosphere, the water cycle would end. There would be no evaporation into clouds, no condensation, no rainfall, no return. Water would no longer move through the sky. And without that cycle, much of the familiar Earth would begin to die in another way, quietly, structurally. Plants would be among the first systems to reveal the scale of the loss, not because they can think, but because they depend completely on atmosphere, on gas exchange, on pressure, on water movement, on temperature stability, on a sun moderated by air. Without that, photosynthesis collapses. Surface plant life exposed directly would fail fast. Forests would not burst into cinematic flames. Fields would not instantly blacken everywhere at once. It would be more systematic than that. Leaves would no longer function normally. Stomata would no longer exchange gases inside a stable atmospheric context. Water loss would become catastrophic. The green layer of Earth would begin losing function almost immediately, and with it, the food chains tied to it. The exposed animal world would fare no better. Anything breathing the open air would be caught in the same first wave of collapse. Birds in flight, animals in fields, insects in open ecosystems. Marine life near the surface would face changing pressure conditions and the instability of exposed water. The atmosphere is not just a human need, it is a planetary condition. Remove it, and life stops being local. It becomes a global systems failure. Then there is radiation. This is where Earth becomes not just hard to survive on, but hostile in a deeper way. The atmosphere blocks and scatters a large amount of incoming radiation. It also works with Earth's magnetic field as part of a larger protective system. Take the atmosphere away, and the surface becomes far more exposed to ultraviolet radiation and other energetic particles. Sunlight no longer arrives filtered, it arrives raw, direct, and over time, that would matter even for whatever remained sheltered, because the planet would now be missing one of its great defenses. The sky itself would become a permanent reminder of the loss. During the day, stars could become visible against the black background of space. The sun would glare like an exposed furnace. There would be no sunrise colors, no twilight gradients, no orange horizon, no blue noon, no red evening. Those effects belong to atmosphere. Without it, the beauty of Earth's sky disappears. And in its place, you get something colder, cleaner, more cosmic, but far less alive. Seen from orbit, the Earth would still be beautiful. At first, blue oceans, white ice, brown continents. But the signs of change would begin appearing quickly. No cloud systems, no moving fronts, no weather spirals, no haze over coastlines, no glowing blanket around the curve of the planet. That thin blue line astronauts talk about would be gone, and with it, the visual proof that Earth is protected. This is also when impact risk changes. Small meteoroids that once burned up in the atmosphere would no longer be slowed or destroyed in the same way. The atmosphere is a shield against constant minor impacts. We almost never think about that, because it works so well. Take it away, and the surface becomes more exposed not just to radiation and vacuum, but to material from space itself. Not every hour, not every minute, but enough that the planet would become a harsher target. And through all of this, the strangest thing is that Earth would still resemble Earth just enough to feel haunting. The continents do not disappear. The mountains do not collapse. Cities do not instantly dissolve. The world remains visible while becoming uninhabitable. And that may be more unsettling than total destruction, because it means home is still there. But home no longer works. This is what Earth without an atmosphere really is. Not a shattered planet, a stripped one. A world with its shape intact and its life support system removed. And after the first minutes, after the first hours, after the weather ends and the water destabilizes and the surface begins reacting to direct space conditions, the deeper truth begins to emerge. Earth does not just lose comfort, it loses category. It stops being the kind of planet we were evolved to survive on, and over time, it starts becoming something else entirely. A world with the same continents, the same gravity, the same orbit around the sun, and none of the invisible systems that made those things feel safe. And that is when the scenario stops feeling like a disaster movie and starts feeling like something colder, a lesson in how little separates a living world from an exposed one. After the first shock, after the silence, after the failed breathing and the black sky and the collapse of weather, the question changes. It is no longer only, how would humans survive? Because the answer to that, for anyone exposed, comes quickly. The deeper question becomes this: what would Earth become? And that is where the idea turns from personal horror into planetary transformation. Because a world does not need to break apart to stop being home. It only needs to lose the thin conditions that made home possible. And Earth's atmosphere is one of those conditions. One of the biggest. One of the easiest to ignore until you imagine it gone. Without it, Earth begins drifting toward a different identity. Not all the way toward the moon, not exactly toward Mars, not into some neat category, but toward a harsher version of itself, a version less buffered, less protected, less alive. The days would become more severe, the nights more punishing. Surface temperatures would swing harder between light and dark. Shadows would feel more absolute, sunlight more direct. The sky would no longer act as an emotional or physical bridge between day and space. It would just be space, always, even at noon. The oceans would continue changing. Their surfaces under vacuum would remain unstable, boiling in places, cooling in places, freezing from the top in ways that feel almost contradictory until you remember that pressure is part of what makes liquid water possible. That matters. Because life on Earth depends not just on water, but on water staying available in familiar states over long periods of time. Take away the atmosphere, and even the behavior of water begins slipping out of the range that built our biosphere. The living skin of the planet would continue collapsing. Plants cannot negotiate with vacuum. Forests cannot adapt overnight to a missing sky. Fields cannot continue feeding civilizations on a world with no air, no rain, no weather, and unfiltered radiation. The great surface chemistry of life would begin shutting down, not dramatically, systemically. And that word matters, because Earth is a systems planet. Atmosphere, oceans, temperature, life, clouds, water cycle, carbon cycle. These are not separate stories, they are one story. And once you remove the atmosphere, the rest begin to come apart. Civilization would not vanish in one cinematic flash. It would become meaningless faster than it collapses. Roads without travelers, cities without breathable streets, aircraft without air, ships on destabilizing water, power systems operating for a while inside structures designed for a planet that no longer exists in the same way. There may still be sealed environments for a time, underground spaces, pressurized shelters, submarines, a few controlled interiors, temporary islands of survivability. But the open Earth, the ordinary Earth, would be over. And that changes the emotional scale of the disaster, because it is not just mass death. It is the removal of normal life from the surface of the planet. And then there is the sky, or what used to be the sky. It would become one of the clearest symbols of what was lost. No clouds, no sunsets, no dawn color, no soft diffusion around the sun, no blue arch over oceans, nothing between the ground and the universe, just direct exposure, just stars behind daylight, just the sense that Earth has been peeled open. That may be one of the most haunting images in the whole scenario. A familiar street, a familiar mountain range, a familiar coastline, and above it, not a living sky, but space. This is why the atmosphere is more than air. It is the interface between Earth and the cosmos. It is the reason the surface feels protected, the reason the planet feels enclosed rather than exposed, the reason light arrives gently enough for life to thrive, the reason water behaves, the reason sound exists around you, the reason temperature has memory, the reason a day outside feels like living on a planet, instead of clinging to the edge of space. And when you picture Earth without that layer, you begin to understand how thin the margin really is. That is one of the deepest lessons inside this thought experiment. Life on Earth is not held in place by something massive and obvious. It is held in place by a relatively thin envelope of gas, fragile enough that from orbit it looks like a glowing line, and yet powerful enough to separate a habitable world from a hostile one. Astronauts talk about that thin blue line for a reason. From space, it looks delicate, almost too delicate. And that feeling is not an illusion. It really is delicate. The atmosphere is not infinitely thick, not permanent, not guaranteed in the abstract. It is a condition, a temporary victory of balance. Gravity holding gases close, chemistry staying active, temperature staying within certain limits, magnetic shielding helping, water remaining available. Life modifying the system that also protects life. It is a living loop. And if that loop breaks, Earth changes category. This is what makes the loss of atmosphere so much more frightening than simple lack of oxygen. It is not only that you cannot breathe, it is that the planet can no longer behave like a place where breathing belongs. That is bigger, colder, harder to fix. Because once you think of it that way, you realize something uncomfortable. We do not live on a rock with air added on top. We live inside a complete system that includes the air. The atmosphere is not above life. It is part of life. It is one of the things the planet is. And when it goes, Earth remains visible. But the world we mean when we say Earth goes with it. That is why this scenario stays in the mind. Not because it is loud, not because it is explosive, but because it reveals how much of reality depends on something you almost never notice. Breath, pressure, sky, weather, warmth, protection, sound, all carried by a layer so familiar that it becomes invisible, until you imagine one morning waking up without it. And maybe that is the strangest part of all. The atmosphere feels ordinary only because it has never failed you. It has always been there, doing its work in the background, holding the world in a habitable state without asking for attention. You do not thank it. You do not see it directly. You rarely think about it. But remove it for one night, and by morning, Earth is no longer Earth in the way human beings have ever known it. So if Earth lost its atmosphere overnight, the planet would not explode. It would not shatter. It would not vanish. It would become exposed, silent, unstable, and profoundly unfamiliar. A world with the same continents, the same oceans, the same gravity, and none of the quiet protection that made those things livable. And that is what makes this idea so hard to shake, because it reminds you that the distance between a home world and a dead world may be thinner than it looks, much thinner. thin enough to glow blue from orbit, thin enough to vanish in a thought experiment, thin enough that most people can live an entire life without ever really noticing it, until they imagine it gone. And once you imagine it gone, the ordinary act of breathing never feels quite as ordinary again.